We're beginning Chapter 4. From the word of the law to the interpretation, President Kennedy attempts to put the CIA under control of the secret team. The CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world by retired Colonel Fletcher Prouty. Beside the towering mountains, the field looked more like pasture land than a hidden airfield. As a result, it was not surprising to see mud-covered water buffalo grazing in the shade beneath the wing of the old World War II B-17 Flying Fortress. Low, rambling sheds, some of them stables and others supply shelters, were scattered along the perimeter of the field. A full stand of grass and small underbrush had grown up through the mesh of the pierced steel plank that had been laid on the ground to form a parking ramp for the collection of clandestine aircraft. Coils of barbed wire had been spread everywhere in a cleverly concealed random pattern, with wildflowers growing through it in abundance. Yet, for all its appearance of tranquility, the remote airfield was the center of a most active clandestine activity. The pastoral scene camouflaged the muted industry of teams of Chinese nationalist specialists who prepared the B-17s for flights over the mainland. Agent information told of trouble in deep China that was being exploited by leaflet drops from the old bombers. Skilled crews who flew low to use the terrain as cover from radar pinpointed the troubled cities on each flight because they were natives of the area. Upon return, one flight crew reported the city ringed with searchlights probing for the planes through the murky sky. The pilot had dropped through the clouds and actually flown the B-17 in a tight circle inside the ring of searchlights, right over the heart of the ancient city, spraying leaflets all the time. As soon as his leaflet cargo had been dropped, he brought the plane down into the dark path of the river and flew at treetop level back to the seacoast. One morning, just after the sun had burst above the eastern peaks of Formosa, I saw two of these aircraft drop into the pasture for a safe landing after an all-night mission. As they taxied to a halt on a steel plank, the Chinese ground crews swarmed around the planes, thrilled at the return of the crews and success of the flight and eager to hear how everything had gone. Then I noticed a few American technicians systematically removing tape and film canisters and other specialized equipment from the planes to the laboratory for development and processing. I couldn't help but ponder the significance of these flights upon these two professional groups and that meaning of the word clandestine, as well as the nature of the policy that accounted for these flights. To these, Chinese flights were a return to the homeland. They were probes at the remaining weak spots in the Chinese Communist shield. They were a serious attempt designed to arouse mainland Chinese to demonstrate that the old regime still cared and that the Western world was still with them. For the Americans, these flights were entirely different. I had traveled to Taiwan with a CIA careerman after having completed 8 months of concentrated staff work, devising and designing an elaborate logistical system for special operations work all over the world. We had flown to Taiwan to see some of the field operators. We had flown to Taiwan to see some of the field operations that were supported by this system. As I watched these two distinct elements work, supporting the same mission from the same base, I saw at first hand a truth that had not been evident back in the Pentagon. The Chinese were very proud of these flights and of their part in doing a job, and it was one in which they could not become identified. If a mission failed, as some did, and the crew and the plane were lost, the Chinese nationalists would honor their gallant men. If a mission was lost, the Americans would have to ignore it and deny that they had played any part in the operation at all. In that sense, warfare is honorable and part of an ancient and respected tradition. On the other hand, clandestine warfare is never honorable and must always be denied. With this in mind, why were Americans themselves involved in these operations and others like them all around the world? The answer is complex. The more intimate one becomes with this activity, the more one begins to realize that such operations are rarely, if ever, initiated from an intent to become involved in pursuit of some national objective in the first place. It would be hard to find an example of a clandestine operation that had been developed from the beginning solely in support of some significant national objective. The lure of fun and games is addictive, and it is most powerful. There would be no intelligence problem at any level within the community if it were not for the inevitability of the desire to divert intelligence operations into secret operations. There would be little complaint and few problems if the CIA was limited to include secret intelligence and no more. In this day of three-dimensional capability with electronic snoopers and satellites, there is no place to hide anyhow, and concealment and secrecy are time-limited devices at best. It used to be that if a nation defended its borders and saw to it that no one entered its territory, it could keep secret its actions, its maneuvers, and its intentions. It was the secret development of the simple iron ramrod that gave the armies of Frederick the Great of Prussia such a predominant margin of superiority in battle. Today, such singular and distinct advances might occur, as with the atom bomb. But the secret, if it is a secret at all, cannot be kept. There is no way to hide it and no place to hide. High-flying aircraft and satellite observation platforms provide us with accurate photographic information sufficient to identify and distinguish such an object as round card table from high-flying aircraft and a satellite observation platform provide us with accurate photographic information sufficient to identify and distinguish such an object as a round card table from a square card table. Special sensors give evidence of crop yields, thermal output variations, and many other areas of information. Nuclear weapons plants can be observed on a regular schedule and activity gauged quite accurately by several methods. Various electronic and communications monitors provide much valuable information that even the satellites cannot get. Sophisticated economic studies provide volumes of essential and very precise information that cannot be hidden except at great cost and inconvenience. The fact that modern industrial production methods require numbering, marketing, and serial coding of products and parts manufactured plays directly into the hands of the vigilant intelligence operator. There can be but few real secrets, and even these become fewer as soon as a little time is involved. A good secret will last only a short time at best. Even the secret of the atom bomb and of its delivery system was more than 50% compromised once the bomb had burst over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As Norbert Weiner has said in his book, The Human Use of Human Beings, when we consider a problem of such nature, such as that of the atomic bomb reactions and atomic explosions, the largest single item of information which we can make public is that they exist. Once a scientist attacks a problem which he knows to have an answer, his entire attitude is changed. He is already some 50% of his way toward that answer, and of more particular relevancy to the field of intelligence is another quote from Weiner. The most important information which we can possess is the knowledge that the message which we are reading is not gibberish. In this context, he is talking about the problem of code breakers, but this is also applicable to many other areas of interest involving data acquired from numberless sources in tremendous quantities. The responsibility lies heavily upon the intelligence system itself to assure that it has been able to separate the wheat from the chaff. Data may not be gibberish as it comes in, but if it is not processed and evaluated properly, it may be useless when it comes out. It is always of paramount importance to know that the information we have is not planted, false, or a product of deception. So even the quest for secret intelligence may not exist as a major requirement to the extent that the CIA purists would like to make it seem, but that is not the real problem. The real problem with clandestine operations in peacetime that have been mounted in response to intelligence data inputs that might have been deceptive or misinterpreted in the first place. During World War II, there were reasons for clandestine operations, and much essential information was obtained by such means. However, as many students and researchers in this area have discovered, the value of such clandestine means was relatively small. As soon as World War II was over, President Truman dissolved the OSS to assure that clandestine operations would cease immediately. 6 months later, when he founded the Central Intelligence Group, he expressly denied a covert role for that authority and restricted the Department of Counterintelligence to a coordinating function. During the debates leading up to the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, proponents of a clandestine role for the CIA were repeatedly outmaneuvered and outvoted in Congress. In his book, The Secret War, Sanchez de Gramont reports the NSA 47 replaced the counterintelligence group with the CIA, a far more powerful body. From the hearings on the NSA 47, it is evident that no one knew exactly what the nature of the beast would be. At that time, a member of the House, Representative Fred Bubsey, made the prophetic and quite accurate remark, "I wonder if there is any foundation for the rumors that have come to me to the effect that through this CIA, they are contemplating operational activities." That congressman knew what he was talking about. And as we look back upon a quarter century of the CIA, it seems hard to believe that he wasn't sure that was exactly what they were up to in the first place. When the law was passed, it contained no provision whatsoever, either for collection of intelligence or for clandestine activities. However, it did contain one clause that left the door ajar for later interpretation and exploitation. The CIA was created by the NSA 47 and placed under the direction of the National Security Council, a committee. This same act had established the National Security Council at the same time. Therefore, the CIA's position relative to the National Security Council was without practice and precedent. But the law was specific in placing the agency under the direction of that committee, and in not placing the agency in the office of the president and directly under his control. In conclusion, this act provided that among the duties the CIA would perform, it would 5. Perform such functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may from time to time direct. Mr. Henry Kissinger was running that, wasn't he? This was the inevitable loophole, and as time passed and as the CIA and the secret team grew in power and know-how, they tested this clause in the act and began to practice their own interpretation of its meaning. They believed that it meant they could practice clandestine operations. Their perseverance paid off. During the summer of 1948, the National Security Council issued a directive, number 10-2, which authorized special operations with two stipulations. A, such operations must be secret, and B, such operations must be plausibly deniable. These were important prerequisites. The CIA really worked at the achievement of this goal toward unlimited and unrestrained covert operations. In its earlier years, the directors, Admiral Sowers and General W.B. Smith, were preoccupied with the task of getting the agency organized, with beating down the traditional opposition of the older members of the community, and with performing their primary function, that of coordinating national intelligence. However, with the advent of the Allen Dulles era, ever-increasing pressure was placed on the restraints that bound covert operations. Dulles succeeded in freeing the agency from these fetters to such an extent that 5 years after his departure from the agency, the retiring Department of Counterintelligence, Admiral Rayborn was so conditioned to the CIA party line that he could not quote the law correctly. In reply to a question put to him by the U.S. News and World Report of July 18, 1966, asking what was the specific charter of the CIA, he said, to perform such other services as the National Security Council may direct. That fifth assignment is the agency's charter for clandestine activities. This is a very small deviation from the exact language of the law, but it is fundamental, and it shows how the agency and even its Department of Counterintelligence in 1966 believed and wanted others to believe that the NSA 47, National Security Administration 47, did in fact give the CIA a clandestine activity charter, whereas it did not. The act carefully stipulated that the CIA could perform such other activities as the National Security Council would from time to time direct. That time-to-time stipulation clearly limits the agency's other services to intermittent matters and does not give the agency any clear authority to perform clandestine activities to prevent the agency from getting any such automatic and routine authority. Another statement of Admiral Rayborn's is equally slanted. In response to a question about clandestine activity, he states that the agency must have a prior approval in detail of a committee of the National Security Council before it can carry out such activity. Again, there is but a shading of the language of the law, but again, it is most fundamental. The law says that the agency is under the direction of the National Security Council. In terms of how the agency should, in accordance with the law, become involved in clandestine activity, the law follows its from time to time stipulation by saying that the agency will perform such activity by direction of the National Security Council. There is a distinct difference between winning approval of something and doing it by direction of the National Security Council. The distinction is in the area of the origin of the idea. The law sees the National Security Council as responsible for the origination of the idea and then for the direction of the agency. The agency sees this as being something that it originates, ostensibly through its intelligence sources, and then takes to the National Security Council for approval. This was not contemplated by the law. Furthermore, the law did not authorize the creation of a committee of the National Security Council for such important matters. It was the intent of the Congress that the National Security Council itself direct such things. It should be noted also that Admiral Rayborn got carried away in this interview with another statement. In response to the question, would the U.S. ambassador in this country concerned know about your activity? Wait a minute. In response to the question, would the U.S. ambassador in the country concerned know about your activities there? Rayborn replied. CIA's overseas personnel are subordinate to the U.S. ambassadors. We operate with the foreknowledge and approval of the ambassador. The reader may have his choice in concluding that Admiral Rayborn either made an untrue statement or that he did not know how his clandestine services operated. I choose to believe the latter. In either case, there are countless instances in which the ambassador does not know what the CIA is doing. Kenneth Galbraith's Ambassador's Journal is all anyone needs to read to see that. Or would someone like to say that Ambassador Keating in India knew what Henry Kissinger and his agency friends were doing in Pakistan and India during the December 1971 conflict? Another case would be that of Ambassador Timberlake in the Congo. It would be unthinkable that the Department of Counterintelligence, in this case Admiral Rayborn, would intentionally make untrue statements in a national publication such as the U.S. News and World Report. The least he could have done would have been to avoid the question entirely. The deeper meaning of this interview is that Admiral Rayborn, after more than a year of duty as Department of Counterintelligence, simply not know how his operating agents worked. He thought he had a clear ticket for clandestine operations, and he thought that arrangements were such that ambassadors would know about got lost in the sauce. He thought he had a clear ticket for clandestine operations, and he thought that arrangements were such that the ambassador would know about the actions of the CIA's clandestine operators. This is a clear example of how far the agency has gone in getting around the law and in creating its own internal drift, which puts it into things almost by an intelligence input-induced automation system, without the knowledge of its own leaders and certainly without the knowledge of the most higher-level authorities. In time of peace, it would have been unthinkable for one nation to intervene openly in the internal affairs of another without some prior understanding. I screwed up the flow with that. I'll go back. In time of peace, it would have been unthinkable for one nation to intervene openly in the internal affairs of another without some prior understanding. All such occurrences, otherwise, are met with disapproval from all over the world. It must be admitted that at the present time, such fine points are sometimes overlooked for various emergency reasons, but these are the exceptions and not the rule. Even in South Vietnam, where there has never been a really independent government, and where the United States, for all its sacrifice and assistance, might be expected, quite understandably, to have some rights, we find that the ambassador leans over backwards, at least in appearance, not to intervene in the internal affairs of that beleaguered nation, and that is a rather extreme example. In the world family of nations, sovereignty is one of the key conditions of existence, and sovereignty is inviolate. Even if we talk about some small countries such as Monaco or Luxembourg, the Code of Nations regards their sovereignty to be as precious as the United States or the USSR. The day this code breaks down will be the beginning of the end of world order and of a return to the rule of brute force. Liberty begins as the aspiration of the individual, and sovereignty is the measure of the absolute power of a state. As we look around us today, we see an erosion of this fundamental international society. It is for this reason that we must look into this situation and consider how important it is to the world community to uphold principles that we hold to be essential and priceless assets of our civilization. Since sovereignty is priceless and must be inviolate, it is fundamental that no nation has the right to do that which, if every other nation did likewise, would destroy this fragile fabric of civilization. We all agree in 99% of the cases that no nation has the right to infringe overtly upon the sovereignty of another, since there is no higher court or other jurisdictional body empowered as final and absolute arbiter over the nations of the world. Judgments in such cases may be left to the honor that exists among nations. When it fails, the only other alternative is for all nations, large and small, to form power blocks and alliances that in one way or another result in dependence upon brute force and sufficient leverage to demand compliance with the doctrine of sovereignty. Such motives in themselves result in the sacrifice of some measure of sovereignty. The price of alliance is generally some form of agreement and limitation of sovereignty that binds each party to assist the other even to the point of maintaining troops on the other soil, or some other such measure. But for lack of other means, all nations must be in the final issue. Wait a minute. Damn, I really got lost. The price of alliance is generally some form of agreement and limitation of sovereignty that binds each party to assist the other even to the point of maintaining troops on the other soil, or some other such measure. But for lack of other means, all nations must in the final issue seek their own security as best as they can, and somewhere in this fabric of common good directs that all nations honor and respect certain unassailable rights. Since no nation would then resort to overt infringement of sovereignty without being ready to face up to a war with that nation, perhaps a war of major proportions involving nations in alliance with that nation, then overt infringement is for all practical purposes out of the question. In all respects, overt violation of the sovereignty of one nation by another would be a more difficult decision to make than a covert or clandestine infringement of sovereignty. If one nation believes that it has so much at stake that it must infringe upon the sovereignty of another nation, it will resort to clandestine means as the lesser of two evils. Choosing a clandestine act leads to a rich dilemma. Either the operation will be successful and it will never be discovered, or it will fail and the guilty nation may be found out. Therefore, when the National Security Council, as a first condition to the performance of covert operations, charged the CIA with the responsibility to assure that special operations must be secret, it was saying they must not fail, and it was saying they must not fail and they must not be found out, and then realizing that such operations are directed and manned by human beings and the failure is inevitable, the National Security Council added a second most important stipulation to the effect that in the case of failure, the U.S. government must be able to disclaim plausibility any part in such an operation. These safeguards take none of the gravity away from the nature of the operation. They simply serve as precautionary and stringent guidelines to remind the agency that clandestine operations directed by an agency of the United States government are serious business. Lest anyone think that the only barriers to conduct Lest anyone think that the only barriers to the conduct of covert operations are those that reflect upon honor, prestige, and other gentlemanly intangibles. We should not overlook the other side of the coin. The U.S. government has been blackmailed to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in goods, materials, and preferential trade agreements as a result of the failures of clandestine operations in Cuba, Nicaragua, Greece, Indonesia, the Congo, Tibet, Pakistan, Norway, and other nations. This is one of the seldom noted and rarely announced hidden costs of such activities. Fascinating. At the time the National Security Council published its guidelines in 1948, they were headed with great care. They were heeded with great care, headed. We'll start that over. At the time the National Security Council published its guidelines in 1948, they were heeded with great care. One of the most important characteristics of a covert operation, in addition to the fact that it must be secret, is that it be very small. There is no such thing as a successful big clandestine operation. The bigger operation, the less chance there is that it can be secret. This issue was one of the most serious matters to come out of the personal review of the Bay of Pigs failure that was made by President Kennedy and his brother. Although the law states that the CIA is under the direction of the National Security Council, there have been times, usually after the failure of a major operation, when the president has had to accept publicly the responsibility of the operation. It is obvious to anyone that the president, as the elect leader of this nation, is responsible for all activity of the government. It is even more evident that the president, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces of this country, bears the final and sole responsibility for all military action, but nothing in the traditional military doctrine provides for the role of commander-in-chief when involved in peacetime covert operations. A nation is not supposed to become involved in covert activity ever. Therefore, its commander-in-chief is not ever... Therefore, its commander-in-chief is not ever supposed to be involved either in the success or the failure of such action. Recent CIA failures such as the U-2, Indonesia, the Bay of Pigs, and more recently Indochina have involved the commander-in-chief. At this point, when a covert operation has failed and has become public knowledge, the president is faced with a most unpleasant dilemma. He must accept the responsibility for the operation or he must not. If he does, he admits that this country has been officially and willfully involved in an illegal and traditionally unpardonable activity. If he does not, he admits that there are subordinates within his government who have taken upon themselves the direction of such operations to jeopardize the welfare and good names of this country by mounting clandestine operations. Such an administration requires that he dismiss such individuals and banish them from his administration. However, by the terms of the definition of clandestine activities, no one should be put in a position of having to admit responsibility for such operations. It is always agreed before the operation is launched that it should fail. It is always agreed before the operation is launched that should it fail, it will be disowned and denied. If this is not done, and if extreme care has not been taken to assure the secrecy, success, and then, if necessary, the deniability of each operation, no clandestine operation should ever be launched. If clandestine operations that do not meet these stringent requirements are set in motion, they should not be pursued. They are falsely clandestine if they do not meet these requirements and thus enter the realm of open inexcusable overt operations, disguised as it were as clandestine operations, or finally, in the last analysis, they are the product of shallow hypocrisy and callousness. During the past 15 years, things have gone that far, and there have been so-called clandestine operations that were in reality bold-faced activities carried out within another country without its consent. Most such events have resulted in coups d'etats, some which have been successful and some failures. But in all cases, the open clandestine activity was rationalized on the basis that the old government was undesirable, that it was going to be overthrown, and a little intervention was necessary anyhow. The Bay of Pigs invasion and all other operational events that accompanied that ill-fated exercise were more or less in that category. The whole campaign was much too large to have been clandestine. It had been too long and too open in the preparatory stages, and there had been too many leaks of what was going on. Secrecy was an hypocritical sham. To top this all off, what secrecy there was, what real deep and deceptive secrecy existed within the U.S. government itself. More effort had been made by the secret team to shield, deceive, and confuse the people inside the government that took place on the outside. And since the great thrust of the program came after the Kennedy election in November 1960, the great bulk of the buildup in secrecy and under elaborate cover story scenarios took place right in the White House, the Pentagon, the Department of State, and other agencies that might have been expected to have shown what was being planned. The result of all this was that no one outside of a very few men at the heart of the secret team, in and out of the CIA, had access to all the facts. I use the words had access to intentionally, because even though a small team of men were in a position to know all that was going on by virtue of their being on the inside of the ring of need to know, they did not know all that was going on because they were not in a position to encompass the entire operation, nor did they comprehend all that they did see. Such an operation, once it began to grow, takes on a corporate existence of its own. And unless there is unusually competent leadership at the top, the kind of leadership that can tighten things up by saying no at the right time and for the right reasons, the whole operation blooms by itself and runs on like wildfire. As we have said earlier, Allen Dulles did not even attempt to apply such leadership, and his chief lieutenants were not in a position to provide it. Thus, it was that the Bay of Pigs operation went off pretty much by itself and foundered. Floundered? Maybe it's a typo. I'm not sure. It was only after its failure that Kennedy really began to see the scope and magnitude of the problem. Kennedy was not experienced in this type of thing. He had a very little useful military experience that would have stood him in good stead here. He had very little useful military assistance that would have stood him in good stead here. And he had not been on the inside of a clandestine operation development before. This is special knowledge. That is not learned by equivalent experience on other walks of life. And he had not suspected the problems that he would inherit with this failure. But President Kennedy was also not the type to permit such a thing to hit him twice. He was smart, tough, and politically alert. He saw no other way to quiet the situation after this dismal failure. He was smart, tough, and politically alert. he saw no other way to quiet the situation after this dismal failure than to accept total responsibility and to try to make the best of a tragic situation. On April 23rd, he appointed a committee to investigate the entire operation, and on April 24th, 1961, the White House issued the following statement. President Kennedy has stated from the beginning that as president, he bears the sole responsibility for the events of the past few days. He has stated it on all occasions, and he restates it now so that it will be understood by all. The president is strongly opposed to anyone within or without the administration attempting to shift the responsibility. This statement was reminiscent of the blanket statement issued by Eisenhower after the U-2 failure in Russia on May 1st, 1960. Once the government is caught in a blown and undercovered clandestine activity that has failed, there can be no other out but to admit that the government of the United States, for reasons of its own, had planned an intrusion into another government's sovereign territory, and then accept the consequences and see what can be made of a bad situation. The committee appointed by President Kennedy considered of Allen Dulles. The committee appointed by President Kennedy consisted of Allen Dulles, General Maxwell Taylor, Admiral Arleigh Burke, and the president's brother Robert F. Kennedy. This was a most fortuitous group for many reasons, and it's worth a few lines here to discuss these men and their selection. Allen Dulles had the special knack of being able to move forward in adversity. He could shed problems and move into the next series of ventures while the government, the public, and the newspapers were sifting through the ashes of a past failure. He was confident in this ability because he knew how to make secrecy work for him and how to compartmentalize so that few people, even within his inner circle, really knew which way he was going to move. It would be perfectly correct to point out that this ability to move within a cloak of secrecy comes not so much from inner wisdom as from the persistent small force, not unlike gravity, that leads the secret team from one operation to another for no other reason that they find a new bit of input data and their built-in feedback system begins to respond like water finding a new course around a temporary obstacle. Thus, Allen Dulles was in an ideal for him situation when he was appointed to this committee. Immediately, he began to set the committee up for the next venture, and he maneuvered the hearings to bring about the most gain for the secret team and his agency, even though he no doubt realized that he would not last much longer as the Department of Counterintelligence under Kennedy. It was important to him to see that his chief of clandestine operations, Richard Bissell, was placed properly in another quiet and influential post, and that Bissell's successor would be one whom he could rely upon to carry out his goals of the agency. Bissell was maneuvered into the job of director of the Institute of Defense Analysis, IDA, Institute for Defense Analysis, a high-powered think tank that works directly for the Office of the Secretary of State. Lost my place. Where are we? Shit. These are thick pages. Fuck. Bissell was maneuvered into this job of director of the Institute of Defense Analysis, a high-powered think tank that works directly for the Office of the Secretary of Defense for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Institute for Defense Analysis is also a frequently valuable conduit for CIA proposals, and that it once introduced without attribution to the Pentagon, the Department of State, and the White House. In such situations, the CIA will pass a paper to the Institute of Defense Analysis team. which may include an agent on cover assignment will take the project to the Pentagon. Then, instead of going into the Pentagon in the usual prescribed manner in which CIA matters are handled, the Institute for Defense Analysis will meet with officials, for example, in the prestigious office of the Deputy Director for Research and Engineering. From there, the paper may be staffed throughout the rest of the office of the Secretary, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the services. This assignment of Dick Bissell to the Institute of Defense Analysis was most helpful to the CIA, and although he was being publicly removed from the Kennedy administration and banished from the public sector, he was as close as ever to the activity of the agency in a think tank totally sponsored by government money. Subsequently, Allen Dulles moved Richard Helms into the position vacated by Bissell. Dulles' next goal was to rebuild the influence of the CIA in the White House. He accomplished this masterfully by seeing to it that Bobby Kennedy heard all the things he wanted him to hear during these hearings. He won him over without the appearance of catering to him or doting upon him. Therefore, he saw to it that Bobby was left to his own thoughts as each day's witnesses. Therefore, he saw to it that Bobby was left to his own thoughts as each day's witness entered the committee rooms in the windowless confines of the inner Joint Chiefs of Staff area of the Pentagon. All he did was to make certain that the train of witnesses was so selected that their testimony would be patterned to present the agency in the best light and to All he did was to make certain that the train of witnesses was so selected that their testimony would be patterned to present the agency in the best light and to inconspicuously transfer blame to others, such as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But most of all, he arranged for witnesses who would provide background briefings of the new agency drift into counterinsurgency. The broad plan for counterinsurgency as a marriage of the CIA and of the U.S. Army has been laid down during the last months of the Eisenhower administration. It remained for its proponents, mostly men of the secret team, to sell it to the Kennedy team. Throughout this complex process, his primary target for conversation to the CIA was General Maxwell Taylor. Here was the right man at the right time for Allen Dulles' exploitation and for the use of the secret team. Dulles was very good at this kind of thing. He had General Edward G. Lansdale this way many times, to the considerable personnel benefit of Lansdale and for the immeasurable benefit of the CIA. Lansdale had had good fortune in the Philippines in making a president out of the unknown Magsaysay, but it had been Allen Dulles with skillful assistance from Admiral Radford and Cardinal Spellman, whose bottomless blank check tactics made the whole thing work. Now Dulles was playing for bigger stakes, and his man was to be General Taylor. Dulles needed a man like Taylor in the White House to rebuild confidence in the agency after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. General Taylor's career was interesting. He always seemed to be displeased with the way things were going, and he always seemed to be pushing some cause against a real or imagined adversary. Years ago, he had followed in the high-speed wake of Admiral Arleigh Burke in attacking the Air Force over the intercontinental bomber B-36 issue and the related strategic concept of massive retaliation. He surrounded himself with a coterie of young hotheads and let them stir up the dust while he pounded the table. In a most characteristic scene, he rose up out of the sound and fury of the post-Suez era in 1956 when Khrushchev had threatened London and Paris with rockets to sound his trumpet for an intermediate-range ballistic missile. At that time, this created quite a stir in Washington and eventually led to the replacement of the Secretary of Defense because of the friction generated by the Army and Air Force protagonists over a missile that nobody needed in the first place. It had just happened that Khrushchev's rockets, to have been effective, would have to have had a range of about 1,500 miles. The Taylor and Madras, Army General Madras, version of the tactics involved to counter them would then require an American missile with an intermediate range, judged by them to be about 1,500 miles, and the Army believed it had just the missile, a rocket called Jupiter. The details of this great debate are not important here. It is simply useful to point out that it is typical of General Taylor to leap into a cause, frequently with a hot-headed team of firebrands, and to joust with the windmill. He got nowhere in the B-36 debates, and he forced an unnecessary showdown over the intermediate-range ballistic missile, which went counter to the best interests of the Army. Later, Taylor had other arguments with the Eisenhower administration that caused him to resign in a huff in 1959. Immediately, he set out to write a book, The Uncertain Trumpet, which purported to show the fallacy of the massive retaliation strategy, but which was more a polemic on Eisenhower administration's relegation of the Army to a reduced role in the national military planning. With this background, he was an ideal figure for Allen Dulles to act as a frontman for the CIA in the White House. The CIA had learned how to turn the restrictions of the National Security Council directives around to their advantage with respect to the promotion and approval of clandestine activities. Since the CIA was bound to win the approval of the National Security Council before it could mount such exercises, the best thing to do was to create a group of participants in the National Security Council structure itself, who would always perform as Allen Dulles wanted them to perform. This left him with a few things to get set up his way. As we have noted, the law states that the CIA is under the direction of the National Security Council, and further it states in the escape clause, which is interpreted to suggest that the CIA may get into the clandestine business, that the CIA may perform such other activities as the National Security Council may from time to time direct. The first thing that the secret team did was to wear down the meaning of the word direct. In the original context, it was the intent of the government that there be no clandestine activity whatsoever, except in those rare instances when the National Security Council might see something so important that it would direct an agency, presumably the CIA, to perform the operation. In the strict sense of this interpretation, the only time the CIA could become involved in the preparation of any clandestine activity would be when directed by the National Security Council and not before. Under the erosion process used by the secret team, this idea of direction became approval. Once the CIA had become involved in a series of clandestine operations, it then would make a practice of going back to the National Security Council, the group 5412-2, as it was in those days, and ostentation. Oh no, I've heard that before. To the Special Group 5412-2 as it was in those days, and ostentatiously brief the next operation as a series, as they hoped after a while the important and very busy members of the National Security Council or of the National Security Council subcommittee would plead other duties and designate someone else to act for them at the meeting. This diluted the control mechanism appreciably. Further, the CIA saw to it that men who would always go along with them were the designated alternates. This is another part of the special expertise of the secret team. The CIA would use secrecy and need-to-know control to arrange with a cabinet-level officer for the cover assignment of an agency employee to that organization. For example, to the Federal Aviation Administration, the cabinet officer would agree without too much concern and quietly tip off his manpower officer to arrange a slot personnel space for someone who would be coming into a certain office. He would simply say that the slot would be reimbursed and that this would permit the FAA to carry a one-man overage in its manning tables. Soon the man would arrive to work in that position. As far as his associates would know, he would be on some special project, and in a short time he would have worked so well into the staff that they would not know that he was not really one of them. Turnover being what it is in bureaucratic Washington, it would not be too long before everyone around that person would have forgotten that it was still there as a special slot. It would be a normal FAA assigned job with the CIA man in it. Then the CIA would work to beef up the power of that position until the man was in a situation that could be used for membership on various committees, boards, and so on. In the case of the FAA, the actual CIA slotted men are in places where they can assist the secret team with its many requirements in the field of commercial aviation, both transport and aircraft maintenance and supply companies. This same procedure works for slots in the Departments of State, Defense, and even the White House. By patient and determined exploitation and maneuvering of these positions, the agency is able to get key men into places where they are ready for the time when the secret team wishes to pull the strings to have a role such as that of the National Security Council 5412-2 Special Group. This is intricate as long-range work, but it pays off. The secret team is adept at the use of these tactics. Of course, there are many variations of the ways in which this can be done. The main thing is that it is done skillfully and under the heavy veil of secrecy. Many key CIA career men have served in such slots as agents operating within the United States government. There is no question about the fact that some of these agents have been the most influential and productive agents in the CIA, and there is no doubt that the security measures utilized to cover these agents within our own government have been heavier than those used between the United States and other governments. Thus, the CIA has been able to evolve and change in the meaning of and the use of the controversial word direct, and then to get its own people into key positions so that when they do present operations for approval, they are often presenting these critical clandestine schemes to their own people. The Pentagon Papers detail much of this, as we shall discuss it later. One reason why Bill Bundy appears so frequently in the Pentagon Papers is because he was a long-time career CIA man, and he was used as a conduit by the CIA to get its schemes for Vietnam and to pass... And he was used as a conduit by the CIA to get its schemes for Vietnam to and past such men as McNamara and Rusk. In this manner, Allen Dulles worked to create a role for the Army black sheep, Maxwell Taylor, It was Dulles' interest to get Taylor into the White House, and it was very much in Taylor's personal interest to get back into a position where he expected to be able to press some of his old ideas, or what was more likely, where he would be useful as the frontman for some of his former staffers. Taylor's approach when confronted with an explanation or proposal that varied from his own was usually a brusque get on the team. In other words, if you were not with him, you were against him. And if you were not on the team, then you would be dropped summarily. Many a good Army officer of that era was brushed aside simply because he tried to point out other views than those held by Taylor. In Taylor's book, The Uncertain Trumpet, he cites his method of operation when he was in opposition to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other chiefs. I arrived carefully prepared with a written rebuttal, drawn up with the help of some of my ablest staff officers. I took the offensive at the start of the session, attacking the unsoundness of the proposal from all points of view, military, political, and fiscal. On the face of it, there is nothing wrong with such a method, and all of the chiefs do that. But General Taylor made a career of changing into meetings with the written rebuttal of some of his firebrand officers and of getting knocked flat off it. Taylor made a career of changing into meetings with the written rebuttal of some of his firebrand officers and of getting knocked flat on his face. This would not be so important in observation if I had not witnessed Joint Chiefs of Staff's meetings with or without General Taylor present at the time when he was the chairman himself, as it would not have become so public a bit of information if some of these written works that he cites had not been published. Oh, damn. Doing it over. And it would not have become so public a bit of information if some of these written works that he cites had not been published in all their unbelievable candor in the Pentagon Papers. Goethe's statements that there is nothing more frightful and ignorant in action may be very true, and we have the war in Vietnam to prove it. But that statement can be topped. There is nothing so frightful and so self-righteous as an otherwise intelligent and experienced man who, to serve his own ends, will champion the cause of the ignorant in action. Allen Dulles was able to get Maxwell Taylor into the White House, and as personal military advisor to President Kennedy, there was much public discussion about the propriety. Okay. Rewind. Allen Dulles was able to get Maxwell Taylor into the White House as personal military advisor to President Kennedy. There was much public discussion about the propriety of placing a general in such a capacity in the White House, ostensibly overseeing and perhaps second-guessing the lawful chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The CIA had its cake to keep and to eat on this point, because not only did it gain Maxwell Taylor as a principal ally at the seat of power, but it finessed a good share of the Bay of Pigs' blame upon the Joint Chiefs of Staff without so much as saying so. Most people were willing to read into this key appointment what they thought was the president's own view, that there must be something to the allegations that the Joint Chiefs of Staff botched up the Bay of Pigs if Kennedy himself, with all he knew after that investigation, brought General Maxwell Taylor into the White House to keep an eye on the military. It must have delighted General Taylor to let rumors and conjecture fly. He could play it either way. He could second-guess the chairman, General Lyman Lemnitzer, as capable a chairman as there has ever been, or he could settle down to his new role of advancing secret team schemes, along with his newly won friends, the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. This sort of army was much to his liking, and this sort of army was already up to its neck in operations with the CIA. Maxwell Taylor was not the White House military advisor in the regular sense. He was the CIA's man in the White House, and he was the paramilitary advisor. Through all of this broad investigation, I am fucking up today, my God. Sorry, guys. Through all of this broad of inquiry investigation, Alan Dulles orchestrated the rest of the committee members into his plan. Admiral Arleigh Burke, without question, the best administrative... What? Admiral Arleigh Burke, without question, the ablest administrator... No, wait a minute, not administrator, damn. Admiral Arleigh Burke, without question, the ablest admiral to serve as the chief of naval operations since World War II, had chaired many Joint Chiefs of Staff meetings during the period when the Bay of Pigs operation was being developed, and since much of the planning involved the Navy and the Marine Corps. The top military man on the CIA staff was a most able and experienced Marine colonel. He was the logical member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to sit on the committee. His position on the committee, however, must have caused him quite a bit of concern, because as he witnessed the unfolding of the operation as Dulles unwound the scheme, he must have wondered if what he was hearing in that room could possibly have had anything to do with the operational information that he had been hearing during the briefings. I need a break. We'll finish this up in a minute.